So guys, today we'll discuss about a very important system that controls our blood pressure of our body, that is the renin, angiotensin and aldosterone system. So this is basically liver, and liver is composed of hepatocyte. You all know liver is composed of hepatocyte, and hepatocyte release a very important protein in your blood circulation, and this important protein is called angiotensinogen. And when your blood pressure falls, that means when you become hypotensive, your kidney perfusion pressure also falls, right? When you have less blood pressure in your body, your kidney is perfused under low pressure, and when your kidney perfusion pressure falls, kidney releases an enzyme, very important enzyme. This important enzyme is called renin, and this renin acts on angiotensinogen and cleaves angiotensinogen into angiotensin I. You can clearly see this renin acts on angiotensinogen and converts the angiotensinogen into angiotensin I, right? And this reaction happens in our blood circulation. So now we have got angiotensin I in our blood circulation, right? And this angiotensin I continue to circulate throughout our blood circulation, and as a process of circulation they crosses the lungs, and in the lung there are blood vessels, and one of the blood vessel in the lung is called pulmonary capillary, right? But there is one type of blood vessel in the lung is called pulmonary capillary. And on the pulmonary capillary is basically composed of endothelial cell, and on the surface of endothelial cell there is an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, and this angiotensin converting enzyme acts on angiotensin I and convert this angiotensin I into angiotensin II, and this reaction happens in many places of our body, but for your purpose you should only know that this angiotensin converting enzyme convert angiotensin I into angiotensin II only in the lungs, but this reaction happens in many places of our body. And the function of angiotensin, now angiotensin converting enzyme convert angiotensin I into angiotensin II, right? You can clearly see angiotensin II is produced and into the blood circulation. Now angiotensin II circulates throughout the whole body and exerts various function. Its main function is to increase our blood pressure. So when our blood pressure falls, right? When our blood pressure falls, angiotensin II is produced, and the function of angiotensin II is to increase our blood pressure. It seems logical, right? When you are becoming hypotensive, your body is producing a chemical that tends to increase your blood pressure, and it is very logical physiology, right? Now we'll see through an animation how angiotensin II is produced in our body, right? I think this animation will gives you a better idea. You can see from the liver there's a protein called angiotensinogen is released, and this angiotensinogen is cleaved by renin into the blood circulation, and renin is released by kidney. There is continuous release of renin into the circulation, but when your blood pressure falls, renin release become very high. You should always remember renin is released 24 hourly in our circulation, but when our blood pressure falls, this renin released by the kidney become very high. So in hypotensive situation, concentration of renin in our blood circulation becomes very high, and the function of renin is to cleave this angiotensinogen and converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin I. Now in our blood circulation we got this angiotensin I in our blood circulation, right? And this angiotensin I circulates throughout our body, and as they continue to circulate throughout our body, they passes through the lungs, and in the lungs there are pulmonary capillaries, and on the surface of pulmonary capillary there is angiotensin converting enzyme, right? On the surface of pulmonary capillary there is an angiotensin converting enzyme, and this angiotensin converting enzyme, you can clearly see this is a pulmonary capillary, and this is the endothelial cell, and this is the basement membrane, and This is pulmonary capillary. On the cell membrane of pulmonary capillary, on the cell membrane of endothelial cell, there is the enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. This is the angiotensin converting enzyme, and when angiotensin 1 passes through this circulation, this angiotensin converting enzyme convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, right? So now we'll see how angiotensin 1 will be converted by angiotensin converting enzyme into the pulmonary circulation into angiotensin 2, right? So this angiotensin converting enzyme act on angiotensin 1 and convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. You can see this is angiotensin 1, right? And this angiotensin converting enzyme act on angiotensin 1 and convert this angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Now we'll see the various function of angiotensin 2 in our body, right? So you know we have actually two kidneys, and kidney is composed of nephron, and this is the nephron, right? And this nephron has many parts. This is glomerulus, and this portion of the nephron is called proximal convoluted tubule. This portion of the nephron, U-shaped loop, is called loop of Henle, and this distal convoluted portion is called distal convoluted tubule, and very easy name. And this portion is called collecting duct or collecting tubule. Angiotensin 2 acts on the proximal convoluted tubule because it has receptor on the proximal convoluted tubule. When angiotensin 2 acts on the proximal convoluted tubule, from the proximal convoluted tubule, angiotensin 2 retains sodium and water. When angiotensin 2 retains sodium and water from the proximal convoluted tubule, this leads to increase of our blood volume, because this sodium and water will ultimately retained into the blood. So this sodium and water, as this sodium and water will be retained into our blood, so they will lead to increase in our blood volume, right? When we have increased blood volume, you may know increased blood volume will lead to increase in venous return. It is logical, right? When we have increased blood volume in our veins, this increased blood will return ultimately to the heart. So increased blood volume in the veins ultimately leads to increase in venous return. And when increased blood will return to the heart, the cardiac output from the heart will also be more according to the Frank-Starling's law, right? And when cardiac output will be more, your blood pressure will be more, because blood pressure equal to cardiac output into total peripheral resistance. But if you are a very interested student, you may ask, why increase in blood volume leads to increase in venous return, and increase in venous return will be translated into increase in cardiac output, and why increased cardiac output leads to increase in blood pressure? Well, I'll explain it here very shortly. When angiotensin 2 acts on proximal convoluted tubule of the kidney, kidney retains sodium and water, right? Kidney retains sodium and water, and this retained sodium and water from the kidney will ultimately enters into the renal vein. This retained sodium and water from the kidney ultimately enters into the venous system of the kidney, and venous system of the kidney is known as renal vein. And where this renal vein drains, this renal vein drains into the inferior vena cava. So this retained sodium and water from the kidney ultimately enters into the renal vein, and from the renal vein they will enter into the inferior vena cava. Where the inferior vena cava will drain, you may know the inferior vena cava of our body will ultimately drains into the heart. So the sodium and water will ultimately drains into the heart. So angiotensin 2 acts on the kidney, proximal convoluted tubule of the kidney, and from the kidney angiotensin 2 leads to retention of sodium and water, and this sodium and water ultimately enters into a renal vein, and from the renal vein, this is the renal vein, and from the renal vein this sodium and water will enters into your vena cava, and this extra sodium and water that leads to increase your blood volume ultimately enters into your vena cava, and from the vena cava they enters into your heart. So it means your kidney retains sodium and water, and this sodium and water will add into the blood volume. So retained sodium and water will be added into the blood volume of the venous system. So increased sodium and water leads to increase in blood volume, and this increased blood volume will return into the heart through the inferior vena cava, right? It is absolutely clear. And when there is increased venous return through the heart, according to the Francis-Starling's law, the more there will be the venous return, the more will be the cardiac output. As long as the heart is healthy, as long as the heart is healthy, the more the venous return, the more will be the cardiac output, and the more the cardiac output, this is the cardiac output. As venous return is increased, your cardiac output will also increase, and when your cardiac output is increased, right, your blood pressure will go up. Now, as a interested student, you may ask why increase in cardiac output is translated into increase in blood pressure. So I will suggest you to understand what is actually a blood pressure. When we call that blood pressure is 120 by 80 or mean arterial pressure is 115, what does it mean? So you have to understand this is the cardiovascular system, and cardiovascular system composed of aorta, large artery, small artery, arteriole, and arteriole branches into capillaries, and capillaries drains into the venule, venule drains into the vein, and vein drain into the inferior vena cava. And inferior vena cava, ultimately inferior vena cava and superior vena cava drains into the heart. And of this whole system, there is a part called major arterial system, right? There is a part called major arterial system, and this major arterial system is composed of aorta and large artery and a small artery. These three things composed of major arterial system, and there are always some blood in this major arterial system. There is always some blood, and these blood in the major arterial system creates pressure in the wall of the major arterial system. This residual blood in the major arterial system creates pressure in the wall of the major arterial system. That means this blood creates pressure in the wall of the aorta, this blood creates pressure in the wall of the large artery, and this blood will create pressure in the wall of the small artery, and this pressure is called blood pressure. When we measure blood pressure by sphygmomanometer, we mean this pressure in the major arterial system, right? By blood pressure, we don't mean the pressure in the capillary, we don't mean the pressure in the vein, we don't mean the pressure in the vena cava, we only mean the pressure in the major arterial system. That means when you tell that a person has blood pressure, you mean that pressure of blood in this major arterial system. That means you are referring the pressure of blood in the aorta, large artery and small artery, not other parts of the cardiovascular circulation, right? So when you have increase in cardiac output, you pumped extra amount of blood into your major arterial system. So when you have increase in cardiac output, you pump extra amount of blood into your aorta, into your large artery and into your small artery, and this extra amount of blood will create extra pressure, and this will leads to increased blood pressure. So what happens when kidney retains sodium and water? This retained sodium and water will be added into the blood volume, will be added into the venous blood volume, and this retained sodium and water will leads to increase your blood volume, and increased blood volume, this increased blood volume will be returned to the heart through the vena cava, right? Will be returned to the heart through the vena cava, and so your venous return will increase, and as your venous return will increase, according to the Frank-Starling's law, your cardiac output will increase, and when your cardiac output will increase, this extra amount of blood will be pumped into your aorta, large artery and small artery. That means this extra amount of blood will be pumped into your major arterial system. When this extra amount of blood will be pumped into your major arterial system, this extra amount of blood will create more pressure in the wall of the major arterial system, and this leads to increase in blood pressure. That is how increased blood volume will be translated into increased venous return, and increased venous return will be translated into increased cardiac output, and increased cardiac output will be translated into increased blood pressure in your sphygmomanometer, right? Now come into another function of angiotensin II. This is basically again the nephron, this is glomerulus, this is PCT, loop of Henle, DCT, collecting tubule, you all know that, right? And this is kidney. On the upper surface of the kidney there is gland called suprarenal gland. Very interesting name because supra means above and renal means above the kidney. So this gland is suprarenal gland. Some author call it adrenal gland, and whatever the name is, that doesn't matter. The matter is angiotensin II acts on this adrenal gland and causes the adrenal release of aldosterone from the adrenal gland, right? Aldosterone is a very important hormone. You'll see when you study kidney physiology, you'll see what is the importance of aldosterone. It is a wonderful hormone, right, of our body. And these wonderful hormone act on the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct and leads to retention of sodium and water. Aldosterone has many functions, but for now you just remember aldosterone retains sodium from the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct. But I swear there are many other functions of aldosterone, and you have to know it later part of your clinical life, right? And this aldosterone retains sodium and water from distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, and this sodium and water will add into your blood volume, right, like previous discussion, and this increased blood volume will be translated into increased venous return, right, through the inferior vena cava, and this increased venous return will be translated into increased cardiac output, and increased cardiac output means you have increased blood volume is pumped into your major arterial system. It means increased blood volume is pumped into your aorta, large artery and small artery. That means increased blood volume creates increased pressure in your major arterial system. It means increased blood volume will create increased pressure in the wall of the aorta, in the wall of the artery, large artery, and in the wall of the small artery. That is how aldosterone increases your blood pressure. Remember, very important. Second thing, this is the brain, and brain has many parts. This green part is called pituitary gland. Pituitary gland has two parts. One is anterior pituitary, which is located anteriorly. Another one is posterior pituitary, which is located posteriorly. And angiotensin II has receptor in this area. And angiotensin II causes release of antidiuretic hormone. Another name of the antidiuretic hormone is ADH. Another name of the antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin. And angiotensin II causes release of ADH from the posterior pituitary. And one of the important function of ADH is to constrict blood vessel, right? Is to call vasoconstriction. When ADH called vasoconstriction, there is increase in blood pressure. There is increase in blood pressure. Second, another function of ADH or antidiuretic hormone is to retain water. Only they retain water from the collecting duct and distal convoluted tubule. When ADH retains water from the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule, right? When ADH retains water from the collecting duct and distal convoluted tubule, this water, retained water, will be added into your blood volume. That means this water will be retained into your renal vein, and this increased water, that means this increased blood volume through the renal vein will be drained into inferior vena cava, and through inferior vena cava they will be drained into your heart, and from heart they will be pumped into your major arterial system. So this increased water leads to increase in blood volume, which leads to increase in venous return, which leads to increase in cardiac output, and which leads to increase in blood pressure, as my previous discussion. So come into another very important function of these whatever called angiotensin II, right? Another very important function. Now, if you are a very interested student, you may ask why arteriolar constriction leads to increase in blood pressure and increase in total peripheral resistance. So one of the important function of angiotensin II is to causes constriction of the arteriole, and this constriction of the arteriole leads to increase in total peripheral resistance, and increase in total peripheral resistance leads to increase in blood pressure, right? So now I'll explain very shortly why increased constriction of arteriole leads to increase in total peripheral resistance, and increased total peripheral resistance is translated into increased blood pressure. Listen carefully, viewers.
For your explanation, I'll explain very shortly. This is heart, and this is aorta, and this is large artery, and this is small artery, and this is arteriole. And your major arterial system, I again recall, your major arterial system composed of aorta, small artery, and large artery, but not the arteriole. Your major arterial system composed of these three: aorta, large artery, and small artery. And amount of blood that are in your major arterial system, this amount of blood in your major arterial system creates pressure in the wall of the blood vessel, and this pressure is called blood pressure, right? This pressure is called blood pressure. So suppose, what is the purpose of this blood in major arterial system? Look at, the purpose of blood circulation is to perfuse to the tissue, perfuse oxygen and nutrition to the tissue. So tissue is located around the capillaries. So this is tissue. So this blood in the major arterial system wants to come into the capillary. So because their major purpose is to perfuse the tissue. But before coming into the capillary, they must overcome the resistance of the arterioles. If arteriole is narrow, it will be very hard for blood in this major arterial system to enter into the capillary. If arteriole is dilated, it will be easy for blood in the major arterial system to enter into the capillary. So arteriole creates the main peripheral resistance. So arteriole creates the main peripheral resistance for blood in the major arterial system to enter into the capillaries, and thus to perfuse the tissue or to supply the tissue of oxygen and nutrition. So if your arteriole constrict, if your this part of the blood vessel constrict, this blood in the major arterial system, I mean blood in the aorta, blood in the large artery, and blood in the small artery, cannot come easily into the capillary. They will accumulate here. They will accumulate. And when this arteriole constrict and blood will accumulate in this major arterial system, this more blood will create more pressure in the wall of the artery. This more accumulated blood will create more pressure in the wall of the major arterial system. So when your arteriole constrict, your resistance, that means arteriole is located peripherally from the heart, so it is arteriolar resistance produced by the arteriole is called peripheral resistance. And you know there are thousands of arterioles in your body, so all the arterioles, resistance created by all of your arterioles is called total peripheral resistance. So when your arteriole constrict, your peripheral resistance or total peripheral resistance goes up. And angiotensin II causes constriction of this arteriole. So angiotensin II constrict your arterioles, right? And when your arteriole constrict, your peripheral resistance goes up. So when your peripheral resistance goes up, there will be more blood accumulated in the major arterial system, and more blood will create more pressure in the wall of the major arterial system. So your blood pressure will go up. So these are the first, one of the important function of this angiotensin II to constrict the artery. Now another important function of angiotensin II is to constrict the venules, right? This venule is constricted.
So now another very important function of angiotensin II is to constrict the veins, right? So this venule is constricted. Angiotensin II causes constriction of these venules. When venule is constricted, capacity of the vein goes down, right? As present, your maximum amount of blood in your circulatory system is stored in your vein. When you constrict the venules and the veins, you compress the venules and the veins. Capacity in these venules and veins will decrease, right? And when the capacity in these venules and veins will decrease, you compress the venules and veins, and this compression will lead to increased venous return from the venules and veins. Due to compression of the venules and veins, blood in the venules and veins will return into the heart. Blood that are stored in the venules and veins will return into the heart through the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, and these these blood that are returned, the stored blood that are returned into the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava will lead to increased venous return, and increased venous return will be translated into increased cardiac output, and increased cardiac output will be translated into increased blood pressure. Because increased cardiac output will add blood in the major arterial system, that means increased cardiac output will lead to increased amount of blood in this aorta, large artery and small artery. That means increased cardiac output will create more pressure in the major arterial system. That means increased cardiac output will lead to increased blood pressure, increased pressure of blood in the wall of the major arterial system, right? So some few function of angiotensin II is that angiotensin II stimulates your stimulate your third center. When angiotensin II stimulates your third center, you take a lot of water, right? Your water intake goes up, and when your water intake goes up, this water is added to your blood volume, and so your blood volume goes up, and increased blood volume will be translated into increased venous return. I explained it previously. And increased venous return, according to the Frank Starlings, will be translated into increased cardiac output, and increased cardiac output will be translated into increased blood pressure, right? I discussed it previously. Second, angiotensin II stimulate your sympathetic nervous system, and function of sympathetic nervous system has many functions. One of the important function on cardiovascular system is to stimulate SA node and AV node, right? When SA node and AV node is stimulated, your heart rate goes up, right? Your heart rate goes up, and sympathetic nervous system will stimulate your muscle cell of the heart, or cardiac myocyte. When cardiac myocyte is stimulated, their contractility or force of contraction goes up, and when cardiac myocyte contracts more forcefully, stroke volume goes up, and when your heart rate and stroke volume goes up, your cardiac output goes up, because cardiac output equal to heart rate into stroke volume in mathematical equation. And when your cardiac output goes up again, more blood will be pumped into the major arterial system. That means it will create more pressure in the major arterial system. That means there will be increase in blood pressure. And see, another important innervation of the sympathetic nervous system is that sympathetic nervous system innervates your arterioles. And when sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, it arteriole constrict, and when your arteriole constrict, right, sympathetic nervous system constrict your arterioles, and when your arteriole constrict, it leads to increase in blood pressure. When your arteriole constrict, I mistakenly write it blood volume, but it will be arteriole. When arteriole constrict, your total peripheral resistance goes up, and it will lead to increase your blood pressure, right? Angiotensin II has many function on the circulation of the kidney. That means it causes constriction of efferent arteriole and maintains the GFR, glomerular filtration rate. You'll learn it details in kidney physiology. It is very important to understand this conception. And another angiotensin II has function. Recently it is discovered that heart cardiac myocyte contain angiotensin II receptor, and in some pathological condition like heart failure, when your cardiac output goes down, or when you have heart attack, you have very high concentration of angiotensin II in that condition in your blood, and this high angiotensin II causes very harmful situation of the cardiac muscle cell, and that is called pathological cardiac remodeling. You'll learn it in details in pathology, right? I'll not discuss here what is the stimulus of activation of renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. That means what is the stimulus of renin secretion. You will learn it details in kidney section. One of the stimulus of renin secretion is sympathetic nervous system, right? When you have decrease in blood pressure, your kidney perfusion pressure falls, and when your kidney perfusion pressure falls, your juxtaglomerular apparatus, that means your afferent arteriole of the kidney, sense that, and they release renin. And second, when you have increased sympathetic nervous system activity, like when you have decreased blood pressure, your baroreceptor system firing rate goes down, and this decreased firing rate will be transferred to the brain, and from the brain there will be increased sympathetic activity. So when you have decrease in blood pressure through mediated by baroreceptor system, you have increased sympathetic nervous system activity, and sympathetic nervous system neurons innervate juxtaglomerular cell and they will stimulate JG cell, and JG cell will release renin. And third important thing you will learn in details in kidney, when you have decreased sodium chloride delivery to the macula densa of the kidney tubule, you have released renin, right? So when you have hypotension, you retains blood flow through the kidney becomes slow and blood flow through the kidney tubules becomes slow. So kidney proximal convoluted tubule will retain lot of sodium and water, right? Proximal convoluted tubule will retain lot of sodium and water. So delivery of sodium chloride to the distal convoluted, delivery of sodium chloride to the macula densa that are located in the ascending limb of loop of Handley will be decreased, and then macula densa will signal the JG cell to release renin. We will learn in details in pathology, in renal pathophysiology, and in medicine, right? And in kidney physiology also. So good luck for your exam. Thank you very much.